The Mafia boss found his analyst bleeding alone at midnight. What he did next cost him everything. The night Yoon Dae-ho walked into Han Seojun's headquarters and called Imani Rowe a thief in front of 40 men, he was smiling. Not the tight, controlled smile of a man, making a calculated accusation, the wide, satisfied smile of someone who had been waiting months for this exact moment. He pointed at her across the conference table like she was evidence, like she was already convicted. Like a black woman with a laptop and a spreadsheet could not possibly be anything other than what he had decided she was. Imani did not flinch, but her hands hidden under the table were shaking. That moment did not begin with the accusation. It began 8 months earlier in an apartment where the ceiling leaked and the cabinets were held together by rust, where a 32-year-old woman sat on her kitchen floor at midnight and decided that bleeding was something she could manage alone. If you've ever been the person everyone assumes can handle it, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Stories like this don't come twice. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The cabinet door came off the hinge. The way things always came off the hinge in that apartment without warning at the worst possible time, on a night when Imani already had too much to manage. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday in late October. Quarterly reconciliation was due before sunrise. She had been awake since 5 in the morning, had eaten half a granola bar, sometime around 3 in the afternoon, and was on her third cup of coffee when she reached into the cabinet above the sink for a glass, and the entire door dropped forward and caught her forearm on the exposed metal bracket where the hinge had rotted through. The pain arrived a half second after the impact, a sharp, deep burn that told her immediately this was not a surface scratch. She pulled her arm back and saw the gash running 3 inches along her inner forearm, already bleeding seriously. Kind of wound that would require pressure and time and a decision about whether to spend 4 hours in an emergency room or handle it herself. Imani looked at the wound for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to the bathroom, found the first aid kit under the sink, cleaned the cut with what she had, pressed a folded washcloth against it, hard enough to make her eyes water, and returned to her laptop. She held the cloth against her arm with one hand and typed with the other. Quarterly reconciliation was due before sunrise. The wound could wait. This was not bravery. Imani would have been the first to say so. Bravery implied a choice. What she had was something more like a long-term arrangement with pain, an understanding built over 32 years that certain things were going to hurt, and the only variable she could control was how much she let the hurt interrupt the work. The emergency room cost money she had and could not afford to spend on herself. The job cost nothing except everything. The math was not complicated. She had grown up in a household in South Chicago where the furnace broke every February. Ferniver, Chemery, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital and still came home to cook dinner. Where help was something you provided and never requested, where needing something from someone else was the beginning of a debt you might never finish paying. Imani had absorbed all of it without being told. She had watched her mother manage impossible things with a straight back and no complaint, and she had decided very young that this was what competence looked like. By the time she was 17, she could read a financial statement the way some people read a novel for character, for tension, for the places where the story didn't quite hold together. By 22, she had a degree in finance from a state school she paid for herself, 3 part-time jobs, and a GPA that made professors uncomfortable because it raised questions about how much the students with full scholarships were actually working. By 28, she had built a reputation in Chicago's financial sector as the analyst you hired when some things didn't add up, and you needed to know why before anyone else found out. She was 32 now, and the something that didn't add up had a name: Hanuel Meridian Group. She had been hired 8 months ago through a consulting firm that placed financial analysts in private companies requiring discretion. The job description was precise and limited: quarterly reconciliation, account auditing, internal compliance review. The salary was significantly above market rate, which told her immediately that discretion was not a courtesy, it was a condition of employment. She had agreed to it without asking questions she already knew would not be answered. What she understood about Han Seojun before she accepted the position could be summarized in 2 sentences. The public sentence: He was the 41-year-old Korean-American owner of one of Chicago's largest private logistics and real estate conglomerates, intensely private, rarely photographed, with a reputation for operational precision that made other executives nervous. The private sentence, the one that circulated in certain rooms that Imani was careful never to be found in, was that Hanaeul Meridian Group's legitimate operations were the visible layer of something considerably larger and considerably less legitimate, and that Han Seojun had not inherited this organization so much as survived it. Imani knew both sentences. She had filed the second one away and resolved never to open that drawer. She analyzed the numbers. She collected her salary. She remained invisible. That had been the strategy. At 2:17 in the morning, with her arm wrapped in gauze and 2 Advil working through her system, she caught the first discrepancy. It was small enough to be an error. $34,000 moved between a freight subsidiary and a consulting account she had not previously cataloged. Timestamp on the transfer was a Sunday evening. Finance staff did not typically process intercompany transfers on Sunday evenings. She flagged it and kept moving. At 2:49, she found the consulting account connected to a secondary entity registered in Delaware. At 3:20, she found the Delaware entity connected to 3 more. At 4:05, she pushed back from her desk, pressed both hands flat against the table, and looked at what she had assembled without meaning to. $1.2 million. 18 months. Moved in fragments small enough to avoid automatic flags, through a layered structure of shell companies and falsified freight invoices and phantom consulting contracts so carefully constructed that it would have remained invisible indefinitely to anyone not specifically looking for a pattern rather than a number. Someone inside Han Seojun's inner circle had been stealing from him, and now Imani knew about it. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's low mechanical complaint and, distantly, someone's television through the wall. Her arm throbbed under the gauze. The laptop screen cast the only light in the room. The rational decision was clear. Close the spreadsheet. Delete the notes. Go to sleep. Come in Monday morning and reconcile the account she had been hired to reconcile and leave the rest of it in the drawer where it belonged. She had spent 32 years making rational decisions. She knew exactly what this one cost. She picked up her phone and called Han Seojun's direct number at 4:19 in the morning. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I found something in the freight accounts. I need to show you tonight." There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. She had learned already that Seojun's silences were not empty. They were where he processed information and made decisions that would have taken most people 3 times as long to reach. "How long will you need?" "An hour. Maybe 90 minutes. Come to the building. I'll be there." The headquarters of Hanaeul Meridian Group occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on the river. At that hour, the lobby was staffed by 2 security personnel who knew Imani's name and waved her through without comment. The elevator required a key card she had been issued on her first day without explanation. The 31st floor, where Seojun's private office occupied the entire east wing, was lit only by Chicago's ambient glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seojun was already there. He was standing at the window when she came in, wearing a dark sweater with the sleeves pushed up, a glass of water on the desk behind him. He looked like a man who had not expected to sleep anyway. He turned when she entered, and his eyes went immediately to her arm. She had changed the gauze before coming. It still showed. "Sit down," he said. "I need to show you the accounts first." "Sit down, Imani." She sat. He crossed to the small cabinet on the far wall, the one she had noticed before and assumed contained liquor, and opened it to reveal a comprehensive medical kit, not a first aid kit, not a box of bandages, but a professional-grade trauma kit of the kind that suggested it had been stocked by someone with specific knowledge of specific needs. He brought it to the desk without asking her permission. She said, "That's not why I called." "I know," he said. "Show me the accounts." He treated her arm while she talked, unwrapping the inadequate gauze she had applied herself and cleaning the wound properly, applying closure strips with precise, practiced hands. He did not comment on what he was seeing. He did not ask how it happened. He listened to her walk through every transfer, every subsidiary, every falsified invoice. with the full attention of a man who understood exactly how serious each detail was. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 4 people have authorization to move funds through those accounts, he said. I know. I identified them. She slid the page across his desk. The trail pointed most directly toward one name, Yoon Dae-ho. Seojun looked at the name for a long time, without changing his expression. Imani knew enough about the Yoon family to understand what that name meant in context. Dae-ho was the uncle of Yoon Chae-rin. The woman Seojun was engaged to marry before spring. The engagement was not a romance. Anyone in Chicago's financial sector who paid attention understood that the Seojun-Chae-rin marriage was a structural arrangement, a negotiated treaty between 2 organizations with overlapping interests in the city's ports and freight corridors. Dae-ho was one of the principal architects of that alliance. Seojun said, without looking up from the page, "Why did you call me?" Imani had expected the question. She had been asking it herself since 4 in the morning. What do you mean? You could have closed the spreadsheet. You could have decided it wasn't your job to find. He looked up at her then. Why didn't you? She held his gaze for a moment. Because pretending doesn't change the numbers. Something shifted in his expression. It was not dramatic. Seojun was not a man built for dramatic expression. It was the specific, almost imperceptible quality of a person encountering something unexpected in a place they thought they knew completely. He looked back at the page. Dae-ho's people will be able to determine which analyst accessed those accounts. I know. You're not invisible anymore. I know, she said again. He closed the medical kit and stood. I'm having someone drive you home. And there will be security at your building tonight. Started to say she didn't need it. Something in his face stopped her. Okay, she said. She gathered her files and her laptop and stood, and at the door she stopped without entirely meaning to, and turned back. Be careful, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. More direct. The kind of thing you said to someone you were worried about, rather than someone you worked for. Seojun looked at her from across the room. Nobody talked to Han Seojun like that. Not his captains, not his attorneys, not the people who had known him for 20 years. Concern, for most people, came wrapped in agenda. It came because they needed something from him, or were afraid of what happened if they didn't appear to care. Imani Rowe had just found evidence that could end careers and potentially lives, had sat in his office at 5 in the morning, with her arm wrapped in inadequate gauze, had told him something that would cost her the invisibility she had spent 8 months carefully building, and the last thing she had said before walking out was to tell him to be careful, as if she were worried about him. He did not answer, but he watched her go. After she left, Seojun sat alone at his desk, the financial records spread in front of him, and began working through everything she had shown him. Not because he doubted her analysis, he had recognized her competence months ago, and the numbers were what they were, but because he needed to understand the full dimensions of what Dae-ho had built. What he found over the next 3 hours was significantly worse than Imani's discovery had suggested. The stolen 1.2 million was not the purpose. It was the funding mechanism. Dae-ho had been financing the construction of an internal faction, not large, not visible, but strategically placed at key access points within Seojun's organization. The plan, as best as Seojun could reconstruct it from the financial architecture alone, was elegant in its patience. Once the marriage to Chae-rin was formalized, the combined organizational structure would create the political cover Dae-ho needed. Seojun's authority would be progressively diluted through procedural mechanisms, board-level decisions, majority governance clauses buried in the alliance agreement, control of port access transferred by contract rather than force. Within 18 months of the wedding, Han Seojun would be the name on the building and nothing else. Dae-ho had not planned to destroy Seojun. He had planned to hollow him out and wear the organization like a suit, and the wedding had been the door he intended to walk through to do it. Seojun set down the last page at 7:43 in the morning and looked out at Chicago coming alive beneath the tower windows, the river catching the early light, the freight corridors already moving. He thought about a woman who had bled alone in her apartment rather than ask for help, who had called him at 4 in the morning with information that endangered her because she could not let a false nusber stand uncorrected, who had told him to be careful as if the answer to that kind of concern was something she expected him to simply absorb and move on from. He thought about everything Dae-ho had built in the dark, and he began to plan. He had not survived everything he had survived by reacting. He had survived by waiting until he understood the complete picture, and then by making exactly one decisive move. He was not ready to make that move yet, but he knew now what it would require. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into him cold and clear, that Imani Rowe was going to be at the center of it, not as a pawn, not as a tool, but as the one person in his world who had proven, in a single morning, that her integrity was not for sale. That was the rarest and most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. He picked up his phone. He did not call Daeho. He called the head of his security fit-out team and gave 3 specific instructions about the building where Imani lived, the route she traveled to work, and who was permitted to come within a certain distance of her without his personal authorization. Then he poured cold coffee into a cup, sat back down at his desk, and kept working. Outside, Chicago moved through its morning. Inside the 31st floor, a decision had already been made that would cost everyone something before it was finished. The only question that remained was how much. The security detail Seojun assigned to Imani's building was subtle enough that she almost missed it. Almost. She noticed the black SUV parked across from her entrance when she came home at 6:15 that morning, still carrying her laptop bag and the weight of everything she had just done. She noticed it again when she looked out her window 20 minutes later while changing the gauze on her arm. Same vehicle, same position. The engine was off, but the exhaust gave it away in the cold October air. Someone had run it recently, parked it deliberately, and was sitting inside it with the patience of a person who had been paid to be patient. Imani stood at her window for a long moment, looking at the car. Then she got 4 hours of sleep and went back to work. She did not mention the SUV to anyone. She did not call Seojun to complain or to confirm or to ask what exactly he thought he was doing. The theme. She filed it in the same internal drawer, where she kept everything she understood about this job, the drawer she had promised herself she would never open, and she went back to being the analyst who reconciled accounts and remained invisible. The problem with that strategy was that she had already burned it to the ground at 4 in the morning. Monday arrived the way bad weeks always did, quietly, with no indication of what was coming. Seojun was in the office before 8. Imani knew this because his assistant, a sharp-eyed Korean-American woman named Bora, who had been with the organization for 11 years and missed nothing, sent a meeting request for 9 a.m. marked urgent. No agenda. No subject line beyond the word discussion. Imani arrived 2 minutes early, which was how she arrived everywhere. Seojun was standing at his window again, same posture as the night before, though he had changed clothes and looked like a man who had processed an enormous amount in a very short time and arrived at a specific decision. There were 2 other people in the room. She recognized both. Park Jin-woo, 53, Seojun's chief of operations, a broad, quiet man with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades making irreversible decisions and had stopped feeling the weight of them, was sitting to the left of Seojun's desk, with his hands folded, watching Imani come in with an expression that gave away nothing. The other was Kim Haeon, 38, Seojun's head of internal security, taller than average, close-cropped hair, with the specific quality of physical attention that certain people carry, the kind that makes you aware of every exit in a room without consciously deciding to look. She was standing near the back wall, and she was already watching Imani when Imani walked in. Seojun turned from the window. "Close the door," said. Imani closed it. "Sit," she sat. She put her bag down at her feet and folded her hands on the table in front of her and waited. Because, in her experience, rooms like this one moved faster when you didn't try to fill the silence before it was ready to be filled. Seojun said, "I went through everything you found. And then I went further." "How much further?" He looked at Jin-woo. Jin-woo unfolded his hands and slid a folder across the table to Imani. She opened it. The first page was a network diagram. 15 names connected by lines of varying thickness to a central node. She recognized 3 of them as senior executives within Hanuel Meridian's operational divisions. 2 more she didn't recognize, but whose titles suggested port-level management. The rest were external legal, financial, logistics. Daeho has been building this for at least 2 years, Seojun said. What you found in the accounts was the most recent layer. There are older layers underneath. Imani looked up from the diagram. How many people inside the organization? That we can confirm? 7. He paused. That we suspect? Closer to 12. The room was very quiet. Jinwoo said, without particular emotion, 3 of those 7 have access to operational logistics warehouse management, freight routing, port clearance schedules. Imani understood what he was not saying. If Daiho's people controlled freight routing and port clearance, they controlled the movement of everything Hanil Meridian actually moved, legitimate and otherwise. What do you need from me? She said. Seojun looked at her steadily. I need you to keep working. Same accounts, same routine. Don't change anything about how you access the records. If Daiho's people are monitoring internal account activity, and they are, I need them to believe that nothing you found has reached me yet. Imani processed that. You want me to pretend I didn't show you anything? For approximately 2 weeks. While Daiho's network is still active inside this building. Yes, she held his gaze for a moment. And if they figure out I already came to you? It was Hyeon who answered, from her position near the wall. We'll know if they start moving on you before they get close enough for it to matter. The phrasing was precise. Imani appreciated precision. She also understood exactly what close enough implied about the margin they were working with. 2 weeks, she said. Maybe less, Seojun said. I need time to confirm the full scope before I move. If I move too early, Daiho pulls the people we haven't identified yet, and we spend the next 3 years finding them one at a time. Imani looked down at the network diagram again. 7 confirmed. 12 suspected. 3 controlling port operations. She thought about the drawer she kept telling herself to leave closed. All right, she said. Seojun nodded. Something in the line of his shoulders changed, not relief, exactly, but the specific easing of a man who had been prepared to argue and had not needed to. One more thing, he said. Imani waited. You'll have new office access protocols starting today. Your floor keycard will also open the 31st floor. If something feels wrong at any point, anything at all, you come directly here. Through regular channels? No, directly to me. She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. Jinwoo was studying the table. Hyeon was watching the door. Imani picked up her bag and stood. I'll have the weekly reconciliation on your desk by Thursday. She left. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, she pressed her thumb into the gauze on her arm until the pressure became something she could focus on. And she breathed, and she told herself with complete honesty that she understood exactly what she had agreed to and had done it anyway, and that the only productive response to that information was to get very, very good at looking like nothing had changed. She was good at that. She had been practicing for 32 years. The elevator arrived. She got in. The week moved the way all weeks moved when you were carrying something you couldn't put down slowly in the long hours, and suddenly, when anything shifted. Seojun appeared in her office on Tuesday afternoon, which was not unusual. He had developed the habit of stopping by her floor several times a week, something that had begun as occasional check-ins and become, over 8 months, something harder to categorize. He would come in, sometimes ask a specific question about a report, sometimes stand at her window with a cup of coffee, watching the city below, and Imani would keep working, and they would exist in the same space with the particular ease of 2 people who had separately decided that silence was not the same as absence. She had started keeping a second cup ready, without consciously deciding to. Tuesday he came in at 2:30 and sat in the chair across from her desk, rather than going to the window, which was different. He put a paper coffee cup on the edge of her desk and pushed it toward her side. I want to talk to you about Sherin, he said. Imani looked up from her screen. That's not part of my job. No, he said. It isn't. She waited. She called me this morning. Someone told her you'd been working late with access to the senior account tier. He paused. She used the phrase inappropriate access. Set down her pen very carefully. Someone told her. Yes. Within 2 days of my finding the discrepancy. Yes. They looked at each other. So Daiho already knows I was in the accounts, Imani said. He knows you accessed them. He doesn't know yet how much you found or what you did with it. You're sure? If he knew you'd come to me, this conversation would be happening very differently. He picked up his coffee. Sharon's concern is performative. She calls to report things she's been told to report. The question is what she was told to report, and why now? Imani leaned back slightly. He's testing whether you'll react. Seojun looked at her. with something that might have been respect. Yes. So if you defend me, he knows I found something worth defending. If I don't, the message is that you're expendable, which creates a different problem. Imani thought about this. What did you tell her? That your account access was authorized and routine, and that I wasn't interested in having this conversation again. She accepted that? No, he said flatly. But she can't argue with it directly without revealing that she knew which accounts you were in, which she shouldn't know. He paused. Sharon is not unintelligent. She understood the structure of leverage. Is she involved in Daiho's network? A long silence. I don't know yet, Seojun said. It was the kind of honest answer that cost something, coming from a man who was accustomed to knowing everything within his operational perimeter. That's part of what the next 2 weeks is for. Imani nodded. She picked up the coffee he had brought, drank from it, and returned to her screen. Seojun stayed for another 20 minutes, not talking, watching traffic below. When he left, Imani sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up a fresh spreadsheet and started building a secondary index of every account she had touched in the past 6 weeks, cross-referenced by access timestamp and query type, sound, so that if anyone inside the organization was auditing her movement through the records, she would know exactly what they had seen and could predict what they would conclude. She worked until 7:30. The black SUV was still outside when she got home. Wednesday brought the first direct pressure. It arrived in the form of Marcus Webb, Hanul Meridian's 46-year-old chief financial officer, a compact, carefully dressed black man from Memphis who had been with the organization for 6 years and whom Imani had always filed under probably fine, but keep your distance. He appeared at her office at 10 a.m. without an appointment and closed the door behind him, which was the kind of thing that was technically within his authority, and also the kind of thing that no one with clean intentions did without announcing themselves first. Morning, Imani. Marcus. He sat down in the chair across from her desk with the ease of someone who wanted to appear relaxed and was working at it slightly harder than the appearance required. I wanted to check in on the quarterly progress. The board's been asking about timeline. It's on schedule. Same as last week. Good. He tapped his fingers twice on his knee. I also wanted to flag something. The access logs for the senior freight accounts. You pulled a pretty extensive audit trail last week. Imani kept her face completely still. Reconciliation requires cross-referencing subsidiary accounts. You know that. Sure. I just want to make sure we're all working from the same scope. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. The senior freight tier has some sensitivity around the active port contracts. I want to make sure anything you flag comes through me before it goes anywhere else. There it was. Imani looked at him for exactly as long as it took to be certain. He understood she was looking at him and not through him. My reporting structure goes directly to the engagement terms, she said, which were set when I came on. Is there something the board has changed about that? No, this is just about communication flow. Then I'll communicate through the established channels. She pulled her eyes back to her screen. Was there anything else? A beat of silence. She could feel him recalibrating. No, he said. Just wanted to check in. Thanks for stopping by. He left. She waited until she heard his footsteps disappear around the corner. Then she opened a new document and typed 4 lines. Web. Wednesday 10 a.m. Senior freight accounts. Sensitivity. Access logs flagged. Wants reports filtered through him. She saved it encrypted, mailed it to an external account she had created for this purpose, and closed the document. Marcus Webb was on the network diagram. Middle tier. She hadn't been sure about his role until this morning. Now she was. She picked up her phone and sent Seojun a single text. Webb made contact. Attempting to redirect reporting. Confirming diagram. The reply came back in under a minute. Noted. Don't change anything. Thursday was quieter, and somehow worse for it. The silence after pressure was its own kind of pressure, the kind that made you examine every interaction. For what it wasn't saying, made you track the duration of a glance, made you notice who got on the elevator with you and who chose the stairs. Imani had grown up, understanding that the period before something was often more dangerous than the thing itself, because it was the period when you could still make a mistake that determined how badly the thing hurt you. She ate lunch at her desk. She ran her reconciliation. She did not go to the 31st floor. At 4 p.m., Bora appeared at her door. Mr. Han would like you upstairs. 15 minutes. Imani saved her work, closed her laptop, and went. The 31st floor was fuller than she had expected. Jinwoo was there. Hyeon. Two men she didn't know by name but recognized by category, the kind of men Seojun kept in specific proximity for specific purposes. And seated at the far end of the conference table, with the composed, assessing stillness of someone who had been beautiful long enough to use it as a professional instrument, was Yoon Shae-rin. Imani had seen her before. In the lobby once, in a photograph twice, and in the particular shape of the space Seojun occupied when her name came up in conversation. She was 35, slender, dressed in charcoal gray, with a single piece of gold jewelry at her wrist, and she was looking at Imani, the way people looked at something they had already decided was less than they appeared. Seojun was standing at the head of the table. He did not look at Imani when she came in, which told her immediately that this was deliberate and that she should follow his lead. She sat at the far end of the table, away from Shae-rin, and folded her hands. Shae-rin said, without preamble, "I've asked Seojun to clarify the scope of your role here." Imani looked at Seojun. He was looking at Shae-rin. "Her role is as contracted," he said. "Financial analysis and internal audit. The access logs suggest something beyond routine audit. Internal audit requires access to internal accounts. That's what the word internal means." Sharon's expression did not change. She was good. She had the specific self-possession of someone who had been trained from childhood to conduct negotiations without showing the negotiation. "I'm asking a straightforward question about operational transparency. And I've given you a straightforward answer, Seojun." Her voice changed just slightly, just enough to indicate she was shifting from the professional register to something more personal, more proprietary. "This is a courtesy conversation. I'm trying to avoid it becoming something else." Seojun looked at her steadily. "I appreciate the courtesy. The answer is the same." The room was absolutely still. Imani kept her hands flat on the table, and her breathing even, and her face at the specific neutral she had developed over 32 years of being in rooms where she was not supposed to be noticed. Sharon's eyes moved to Imani for the first time since she'd entered. They stayed there for 3 seconds, not hostile, exactly, but with the particular quality of assessment that preceded a decision. Then she looked back at Seojun. "My uncle wants a meeting. This week. I'm aware. He's concerned about the integrity of the alliance accounts. Tell him I'll be in touch." Another silence. Sharon stood, adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, and looked once more at Imani before she moved toward the door. At the door, she stopped. "Ms. Rowe," she said, without turning, "I'd be thoughtful about the scope of your ambitions here." She left. The door clicked shut. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Then Jinwoo exhaled slowly through his nose. One of the unnamed men shifted his weight. Haein was watching the door with the focused attention of someone calculating a specific variable. Seojun sat down at the head of the table. "Daeho wants the meeting to pressure test whether I know," he said. "He'll use Shae-rin to read my response and report back." "She'll tell him you protected me," Imani said. "He'll take that as confirmation that I found something." "Yes. Then you just shortened your 2 weeks." Seojun looked at her. "I know," Jinwoo said. "If he moves before we've confirmed the full network." "I know," Seojun said again. Imani looked at the network diagram that Jinwoo had placed on the table, an updated version from Monday. She could see 3 more names added in the outer ring. She looked at the port operations cluster. She looked at the financial layer, where Marcus Webb's name now had a line she didn't recognize on Monday, connecting it to a name she'd seen in the freight accounts. She said, "There's a way to accelerate the timeline without tipping Daeho." Everyone looked at her. "The Shell Corporation structure, the Delaware entities I found last week. They route through a holding account that processes quarterly. The next processing window is in 9 days. She looked at Seojun. "If we let the transfer run normally, we can trace the receiving end in real time and identify accounts we haven't found through the static records. Daeho won't know we're watching the transfer because he thinks I only found the first layer." A silence. Jinwoo said slowly, "You want to let the money move. I want to watch where it goes. We'll know exactly who gets activated and what they're connected to. 1 transfer, 9 days, and we have the complete picture." Seojun was looking at her with the particular focused stillness she had come to recognize as the mode in which he made decisions that mattered. "If anything goes wrong during that window," he said, "if Daeho finds out we're watching, Then we move early with what we have. She met his eyes. But if it works, you'll have everything. Another silence. Longer, Seojun said. 9 days. He nodded. The meeting ended. Imani rode the elevator back to her floor, walked to her desk, sat down, and opened her laptop with hands that were steady enough and a pulse that was not. 9 days. A sound like greenwood splitting. She had just volunteered to stay inside a building where at least 7 people were working against the man she had decided to trust, in an organization where the woman engaged to that man had just told her to be thoughtful about her ambitions, with a CFO actively monitoring her account access and reporting to a network she had helped build a diagram of. And she had done all of this because she could not let a false number stand uncorrected. She pressed her thumb into the gauze on her arm. She breathed. She pulled up the quarterly reconciliation and kept working. Friday came, and with it, something that made everything else so far feel like the quiet before the quiet. She was in the building's 3rd-floor break room. At 7 in the evening, the floor was empty. Most staff had gone home. She had stayed to finish. A secondary ledger cross-reference, pouring the last of the coffee, from a pot she probably should have made fresh an hour ago when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Not the cadenced, purposeful steps of security making rounds. Slow, deliberate, stopping outside the door. Imani did not move. She held the coffee cup in both hands and stood facing the window over the break room counter and waited with the specific quality of stillness she had learned young, not frozen, not afraid, but absolutely controlled. Because the worst thing you could do in a room with something wrong in it was broadcast that you knew. The footsteps moved on. She counted to 30 before she turned around. The break room door was slightly ajar. She was certain she had closed it. She looked at it for a long moment, then set her coffee down, picked up her bag with her laptop, and walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty in both directions. But on the floor, directly in front of the door, was a single photograph. She looked at it without picking it up for a full 10 seconds. It was taken from a distance, with a lens capable of significant magnification, but the subject was absolutely clear. Imani, at her apartment window, taken from outside the building, looking out at the black SUV. It had been taken 2 days ago. Someone had been watching her watch the car. Someone who was not Seojun's security team, because Seojun's security team would have no reason to photograph her and leave the photograph where she would find it alone at 7 p.m. on an empty floor. This was a message. We know where you are. We know you've noticed us. We know you're not as invisible as you think. Imani stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone and sent Seojun a text. Need to come up. Now the reply came in 20 seconds. Come. She took the elevator to the 31st floor with the photograph in her bag, and the specific bone-deep understanding of someone's just crossed a threshold they cannot uncross, that the invisible life she had built so carefully, the strategy of existing without being seen, the 32-year-long discipline of needing nothing from anyone, had just been removed as an option. She was not invisible anymore. She had known that since Tuesday morning on her kitchen floor, somewhere between the first ring and the second ring of his phone. But the photograph made it real in a way that knowledge alone had not. The elevator opened on the 31st floor. Seojun was already at the elevator bank, which meant Hyen had called him the moment Imani sent the text, which meant the 31st floor was in a state of active readiness that she had not seen before, and which clarifies in a single image exactly how seriously he was taking the 9 days ahead. She handed him the photograph without speaking. He looked at it. Something moved in his face, not fear, not surprise, but the cold, focused quality of a man who has been handed confirmation of his worst operational assessment and is already 3 steps into the response. He looked up at her. You're not going back to your apartment tonight, he said. Imani opened her mouth. Imani, she closed it. The way he said her name, not an order, not a warning, but something rawer than either. Something that landed in the specific register of one person saying to another, I cannot manage this if you are not safe, stopped the argument before she made it. She stood in the elevator bank on the 31st floor of a glass tower on the Chicago River, with a wound on her arm she had originally planned to manage alone, and a photograph in Seojun's hand that confirmed she had already been found. A sound like greenwood splitting, and she understood with complete clarity that the woman who had spent 32 years proving she needed nothing from anyone had just run out of room to keep proving it. "Okay," she said. It was the smallest word she had ever said that cost her the most. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet office, whose address appeared nowhere in any public record, Yoon Dae-ho set down his phone after receiving a brief report from a man he trusted, folded his hands, and smiled the smile of someone who had just confirmed that his timeline was still intact, and that the analyst, who had stumbled too close to his architecture, was now exactly where he needed her to be visible, rattled, and running out of options. He had no idea how wrong he was, but that realization was still 9 days away. Seojun did not take her to one of the corporate suites. He took her to a residential floor that most of Hanul Meridian's staff did not know existed, the 29th, accessed by a separate elevator that required both a key card and a 6-digit code he entered himself without explaining. The apartment was spare and clean and clearly maintained for functional use rather than comfort. A bed, a desk, blackout curtains, a kitchen stocked with basics, and windows that faced the river on one side and a blank concrete wall on the other. There was nothing personal in the space, nothing that suggested anyone had ever lived there, rather than simply occupied it temporarily while something dangerous resolved itself elsewhere. Imani set her bag on the desk and looked around without comment. Seojun stood in the doorway. "Hyun will be on the floor tonight. Code for this elevator is..." "I'll remember it," Imani said. "You only need to say it once." He said it once. She filed it. "There are clean clothes in the closet," he said. "Various sizes." "Don't ask. I wasn't going to." A pause. "Is there anything you need?" he asked. She turned and looked at him across the room. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not as a posture of control, but as the specific stance of a man who had run out of easy things to do and was staying in the room anyway because leaving felt wrong. "I need 9 days to not be wasted," she said. "They won't be. And I need you to tell me one thing honestly." He waited. "How many people in this building knew about Dae-ho's network before I found it?" The silence stretched long enough to be its own answer. "Then I don't know." She nodded. That was the honest answer. She had expected something closer to none, and was not surprised it wasn't. "All right," she said. "Good night." He left. She did not sleep for 2 hours. She sat at the desk with her secondary ledger open on her laptop and worked through the Shell Corporation's structure. Again from the beginning, a sound like green wood splitting. Not because she expected to find something new, but because it working was the only thing that reliably quieted the part of her brain that had been running threat assessments since she found the photograph on the hallway floor. Someone had been close enough to her apartment building to photograph her through a window from the street, which meant they had been watching before the SUV arrived, or they had been watching the SUV, or worst case they had access to information about Seojun's security positioning that should have been corrected, that should have been internal. She added that variable to her mental model and kept working. 2 a.m. she finally closed the laptop, changed into clothes from the closet that fit well enough, and lay down on the bed in the dark with the river, doing what rivers did at 2 a.m. in Chicago in October, which was move without caring about any of it. She was asleep in 6 minutes. She woke at 5:47 to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, measured, purposeful, Haeyeon's specific cadence moving past the door without stopping. She lay still for a moment, cataloged the sounds of the floor, determined nothing was wrong, and got up. The next 4 days moved with the particular compressed intensity of a situation that had a deadline attached to it. Seojun had 3 confirmed meetings with Dae-ho scheduled over the following 2 weeks, a standing weekly operations call, a port contract review, and a preliminary alliance summit that Dae-ho had proposed, and Seojun had accepted without indicating he knew the summit's actual purpose. Set neutrality. Seojun deducted neutrality of a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where showing what you knew was more dangerous than knowing it. Imani received brief reports after each one through Hyun, not operational details, but enough to track whether Dae-ho's confidence was holding. It was holding, which meant their cover was intact, which meant the transfer window was still viable. On the 3rd day, Marcus Webb stopped coming to her floor. This was more alarming than his visits had been. Webb stopping meant Webb had been told to stop, which meant Dae-ho had pulled him back, which meant something in Dae-ho's assessment had shifted. She flagged it to Seojun. His response noted, "Hold position." She held position. On the 5th day, Sharon came to the building. Imani knew because Bora sent a building-wide calendar notice about a private luncheon on the 31st floor, standard protocol for high-level guests. The kind of notice that contained no information while technically providing information. Imani went about her day and did not go to the 31st floor and did not ask what the luncheon was about. At 3 p.m., Seojun appeared at her office. He closed the door, which was something he had never done before. Imani set down her pen. He sat in the chair across from her and said without preamble, "Sharon told me something during lunch." "All right, Daiho is moving the transfer window. He's processing the shell accounts early. He's not waiting for the quarterly cycle." Imani felt the bottom drop out of the next 9 days. "When?" "She thinks tomorrow night. She's not certain." "Why is she telling you?" Seojun was quiet for a moment. "Because she wants out." Imani looked at him carefully. He looked back with the expression of a man who had spent 3 hours processing something he had not expected and had arrived at a provisional conclusion he did not entirely trust. "She came to you voluntarily," Imani said. "Yes." "And you believe her?" Pause. "I believe she's afraid. Whether that makes her reliable is a different question." Imani thought about Sharon in the conference room. 3 days ago, the composed, assessing stillness, the gold cuff at her wrist, the careful warning delivered at the door, like it cost her something to give it. She thought about what it would cost a woman like Sharon to walk into a private lunch with her fiancé and tell him her uncle was moving early. "She's not doing this for you," Imani said. "No," Seojun agreed. "She's doing it because if Daiho's plan succeeds, she becomes the wife of a hollowed-out figurehead with no real authority, which was not what she agreed to. So she wants the alliance to survive, but Daiho removed." Something like that. Imani looked at the window. The light was already going flat in the way it went flat in Chicago in late October, that particular early evening gray that made the whole city feel like it was waiting for something to happen. "If he moves the transfer tomorrow night, we have tonight to prepare," she said. "Yes." "Hyun's team can watch the receiving accounts in real time?" "She's already setting it up." Imani nodded. "Then we don't change anything. We let the money move, and we watch every account it touches. If Sharon is right about the timing, we'll have the complete network picture by morning." Seojun looked at her steadily. "And if Sharon is wrong, or if this is a test, then we deal with that when it happens." She met his eyes. "We don't have another option." He stood. At the door, he stopped. "Try to get some sleep tonight." "You too," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, incomplete, the kind of expression that had probably never made it all the way to his face in the presence of anyone else. Then he left. Imani sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and started building the real-time monitoring framework she would need to track the transfer the moment it started moving. She worked until midnight. At 12:41 a.m., Hyun knocked once on the apartment door and said through it, "It started." Imani was already awake. She opened the door with her laptop under her arm. 31st floor was transformed. 3 additional people she hadn't met were working at stations, set up along the conference table, technical staff, focused, running monitoring interfaces she recognized from financial forensics work she'd done in a previous life. Jinwoo was at the far end of the table, on the phone, speaking in low Korean she didn't follow, but whose cadence told her he was relaying instructions, not receiving them. 2 of Seojun's security personnel were posted at the elevator bank, which had never been staffed in her presence before. Seojun was standing at the head of the table when she walked in. "It's moving," he said without preamble. First transfer just cleared the primary Delaware entity. Imani sat down at the open station beside Hyun and pulled up her monitoring framework. The transfer was already visible, a figure that matched the architecture she had mapped, moving through the first shell layer exactly as she had predicted. "Give me the receiving chain," she said. Hyun put it on the central screen. For the next 40 minutes, the room was almost entirely quiet, except for the occasional terse exchange between technical staff and the low sound of Chicago at 1 in the morning beyond the windows. Imani watched the transfer move through 4 shell layers in sequence, each one peeling back to reveal the next. The money fragmenting and reconsolidating in a pattern that was beautiful in the specific ugly way that sophisticated financial crime was always beautiful, intricate, patient, constructed by someone who understood exactly how oversight systems were built and had designed every layer to fall just inside the threshold that would trigger a flag. She tracked every fragment. At 1:43 a.m., the transfer hit the fifth layer and stopped. Imani's hands went still on the keyboard. It stopped. One of the technical staff said, "I see it," Hyon said. The room waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. "Did it clear the layer?" Seojun asked. "No," Imani said slowly. "It didn't clear, it consolidated. All the fragments, every dispersal from layers 2 through 4, they're consolidating into a single receiving account at layer 5. She stared at the account identifier on her screen. Her stomach dropped 6 floors. "That account," she said very carefully. "Pull the registration." One of the technical staff ran it. The registration came up on the central screen. The room went absolutely silent. The account at layer 5, the account that had just received the consolidated transfer of everything, Daeho had moved through 18 months of careful layering, was registered to a holding company whose sole officer was listed in 3-year-old. Incorporation documents as a nominee director, standard practice for shell construction, unidentifiable. But the registered address of the holding company was not in Delaware. It was not in any offshore jurisdiction. It was a Chicago address, a specific building, a specific floor. It was the legal address of Haniel Meridian Group's internal compliance division. Imani read the address twice. Then she looked at the officer name again, the nominee director, listed as a formality, the kind of name you put on a document when you want the document to be technically complete and functionally untraceable. The name was Park Jin-woo. The silence in the room lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Seojun said, very quietly, in a register Imani had never heard from him before, "Jin-woo." Jin-woo was at the far end of the table. He was no longer on the phone. He was looking at the central screen with an expression that did not have the quality of shock, because shock requires encountering something you did not expect, and the thing on the screen was something Park Jin-woo had built himself. 3 years ago, with full knowledge of what it was and what it would eventually do. The expression he had was the expression of a man who had calculated that this moment might come and had decided the calculation was acceptable and was now discovering that the moment felt different in the room than it had felt in the calculation. Seojun turned to face him. Everyone else in the room did the same, in the specific, involuntary way that people turn toward the thing that is about to matter most. Jin-woo set down his phone. "How long?" Seojun said. Pause. 3 years, Jin-woo said. His voice was completely steady. "That was the worst part. Since before Daeho approached me." "He didn't approach you." "No," Jin-woo said. "I approached him." The room's silence now had a different quality. Not the silence of people waiting for information, but the silence of people absorbing something that was reorganizing everything they thought they understood about the last 3 years. Imani looked at Seojun. His face had gone to a place she had never seen on it, not anger, not betrayal in the theatrical sense, but something far more interior and far more devastating. The specific expression of a man discovering that the architecture of trust he had built his life inside was constructed on a floor that had been rotting for 3 years without his knowledge. "Why?" Seojun said. It was not a question about motivation. Imani understood that. It was a question about something older than the money, older than Daeho's network. A question between two men who had known each other for 20 years, across distances and losses and decisions that most people never had to make. Jin-woo looked at him directly. "Because you were going to do with this organization what your brother should have done, pull it apart, legitimize it, turn it into something that couldn't sustain what it was built on. And everything I built inside it would have been gone. So you built something else. I built something that would last. With Daeho. Daeho was a mechanism," Jin-woo said flatly. "He was always a mechanism. The organization that emerged after the restructuring would not have been his. He understood that differently than he should have." Seojun said, "You were going to remove me and then remove him." Jin-woo did not answer. Which was the answer? Imani was watching Seojun with the focused attention of someone tracking a structural load, measuring how much weight a thing could hold before the way it held changed. He was standing absolutely still, both hands flat on the conference table. His breathing was controlled in the specific way that control was a choice being actively made rather than a natural state. She looked at Haein. Haein was already looking at her. One small movement of Hyun's eyes toward the security personnel at the elevator, a question. Imani gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Let him have this moment, Seojun said. The people on the diagram. How many of them were yours? 4, Jinwoo said. The rest were Daeho's. Web? Daeho's. The port operations cluster? Split. 2 mine, 1 his. Seojun straightened up from the table. He looked at Jinwoo across the length of the room for a long time. You treated her wound, he said finally, and Imani realized with a jolt that he meant the night she'd come in with the photograph. When Jinwoo had been present in the 31st floor meeting, when Jinwoo had sat across the table from her with his hands folded, tension giving nothing away, and his expression giving away while she explained the trap she was proposing to set. Jinwoo had known the transfer was being moved early, because Jinwoo had moved it. Not Daeho. Jinwoo. Sharon's information had been accurate because someone had fed it to Sharon to feed to Seojun, to get them into position. To get Imani in this room, at this monitoring station, at 1:43 in the morning, pulling up an account registration that would detonate the one relationship inside Hanul Meridian that Seojun had treated as structurally inviolable. Imani's hands were very still on the keyboard. She said, without raising her voice, the photograph. Jinwoo looked at her. Outside my apartment building, she said. The one left on the hallway floor. That was yours. Pause. Yes. You wanted me moved into this building. I wanted you visible, Jinwoo said. Contained. In a location where your access to the accounts could be monitored in real time, and where, when this moment came, you would be in the room. To add legitimacy, Imani said. When the account registration came up, you needed it discovered by the analyst, who found the original discrepancy. Not by Seojun's security team. By me, because I have no organizational stake. Because my credibility is the one thing in this room that Daeho's lawyers can't argue against. Jinwoo looked at her, with something that was almost respect. You're very fast. Tell me why, she said. Not the strategic version. The real one. Something shifted in his expression. For the first time in this conversation, he looked like a man who was tired rather than a man who was controlled. Because if Seojun had found it through his own security operation, it becomes an internal power struggle, Jinwoo said. Lawyers, counterclaims, organizational chaos. Every captain picks a side. Takes years. He paused. But if an outside analyst with no history in the organization and no personal loyalty to anyone finds the evidence and presents it in front of witnesses, it's clean. It's finished. There's no counter-narrative. Except, Imani said, you didn't account for one thing. He waited. You built this to destroy Seojun's trust in Daeho and remove Daeho in the fallout. But you put your own name on the Layer 5 account, which means the evidence that takes down Daeho also takes down you. Jinwoo was quiet. Unless, she continued, you were planning to be somewhere else when the account registration was pulled. Unless someone else was going to be running the technical station. Unless the name that came up was going to be presented to a room that did not include you. She looked at the room. At the 3 technical staff people she didn't know, had never met before tonight, brought in specifically for this monitoring operation. Jinwoo had staffed this room. She looked back at him. Who was supposed to run this station tonight? She said. A beat. Not you, Jinwoo said. Who? It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. He looked at her steadily. Someone who would have read the registration, identified the compliance division address, and concluded that Daeho had embedded a mole within Hanul's own compliance structure. Seed CT setting. Someone who would never have run the officer name because the officer name was a nominee, and nominees don't matter, and by the time anyone looked deeper, the account would have been restructured. Imani understood. If she hadn't run the officer name, if the technical staff Jinwoo had brought in had been running the station, instead of her the Layer 5 account would have looked like Daeho's infiltration of Hanul's compliance structure. Damning for Daeho. Clean for Jinwoo. She had run the officer name because she always ran every available field. Because she could not look at incomplete data and call it complete. Because pretending didn't change the numbers. Take him downstairs, Seojun said. The security personnel at the elevator bank moved. Jinwoo stood. He straightened his jacket, a small habitual gesture, the kind of thing a man did when the body remembered its dignity, even when everything else had been stripped away. He walked toward the elevator bank without being pulled, which was either composure or the specific resignation of a man who had spent 3 years building toward a moment and was now watching it resolve in a direction he had not modeled. The elevator, he stopped. He looked back at Seojun. "For what it's worth," Jinwoo said, "I never doubted your ability. I doubted your direction." Seojun said nothing. The elevator closed. The room held its collective breath for another moment, and then the technical staff began doing what technical staff did when an operation had delivered its data they started compiling. Archiving, building the documentary record that would convert a real-time discovery into something that could survive scrutiny. Imani sat at her station and did not move for a long time. Her hands were in her lap. Her screen was still showing the Layer 5 account, the account that had just unraveled the most trusted relationship in Han Seojun's professional life and rewritten the operational map of everything she thought she understood about Daiho's network. Daiho was real, his network was real, but he was not the architect. He was the second layer. She heard Seojun's footsteps come up behind her and stop. She didn't turn around. "The 4 people in Daiho's network that Jinwoo identified as his," she said. "We need to pull them tonight. Before Jinwoo can contact anyone. Hyon is already on it, and the port operations cluster the 2 that were Jinwoo's. They'll know something went wrong when Jinwoo doesn't check in by morning. I know. If they activate before we can isolate them, Daiho finds out the network is blown. He'll move to emergency protocols. Imani." She stopped. "I know," he said again. "We're handling it." She finally turned in the chair and looked up at him. He looked like a man who had just walked through something that had cost him, something he could not get back, but who was still standing and still moving, and had made peace with both of those facts simultaneously, because he did not have the luxury of processing them separately. His face was composed. His eyes were not. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "For what? For not catching Jinwoo's layer earlier. I built the network diagram from the financial records, and I missed it because the compliance division accounts weren't in the tier I was given authorization for. If I had pushed for broader access earlier." "Stop," he said. She stopped. "You found what you found," he said. "You found more than you were supposed to find, and more than anyone else would have found, and you found it because you can't leave a number wrong." He paused. "That's not a failure." She looked at him for a moment. "It feels like one." "I know," he said, and the weight of those 2 words, the same 2 words he'd said to her in the medical kit moment on the night. This all began landed differently now, heavier and more specific. A sound like green wood splitting, the weight of a man who understood exactly what it felt like to run a complete analysis and still find yourself surprised by what was standing behind the last door. She turned back to her screen. "I need to rebuild the network diagram," she said. "Jinwoo's 4 names need to be extracted. And then we need to figure out who Daiho thinks his chain of command is. Because if Jinwoo was running Daiho rather than the reverse, Daiho may not know the full scope of what just collapsed. You can do that from here? Give me 2 hours." He pulled a chair from the next station and sat down beside her, not to help, because she did not need help with this, but because he was not leaving. And they had arrived at the specific point in whatever this was between them, where he no longer pretended the reason he stayed was operational. She registered it without commenting on it. She opened a new framework and started rebuilding. 3:45 a.m., she had a revised diagram. Cleaner, more complete. The Jinwoo layer isolated, Daiho's actual network visible beneath it smaller than they had believed, more fragile. Constructed by a man who thought he was the senior partner in an arrangement and had been managed throughout. She printed it and set it in front of Seojun. He studied it. "Daiho has 8 people," he said. "Yes. 3 in port operations, 2 financial, 1 legal, 2 external freight contractors who don't know the rest of the structure. And without Jinwoo's 4, his access to the compliance division is gone." "Yes. Which means his ability to restructure the alliance agreement through procedural mechanisms is gone." She tapped the diagram. "His remaining play is the summit. The preliminary alliance meeting he scheduled. His last point, leverage in front of witnesses, with the organizational structure of both families present." Seojun looked at the diagram for a long time. "He's going to use the summit to make a move," Seojun said. "He has to. After tonight, his network is going to start feeling the pressure even if he doesn't know why yet. The moment Hyun's team pulls Jinwoo's 4 people, the network loses coherence. Daiho will feel it as static small failures, delayed responses, access that suddenly doesn't work. He'll accelerate. When is the summit? 5 days. 5 days. Seojun set the diagram down and looked at the Chicago River through the floor-to-ceiling windows, black and moving, and indifferent at 4 in the morning, the way rivers always were. He's going to come at you directly, he said, at the summit. If he's done the accounting on what's been happening, he'll know the analyst is the point of vulnerability. He'll try to neutralize your credibility before you can use it. Imani had been thinking about this since she first saw Daiho's name on the network diagram, since before she understood Jinwoo's layer, since the photograph on the hallway floor. Then we need to make sure that when he tries, there's nothing left to neutralize, she said. The ledger has to be complete. Every transaction, every account, every shell entity, documented, verified, and presented in a format that 30 people in a conference room can follow without a finance degree. 5 days. 5 days, she said. She looked at the diagram again. At Daiho's name at the center of a network that was smaller than it had seemed and more exposed than he knew. At Jinwoo's layer above it, the layer that had been the real architecture all along. The layer that had used Daiho the way Daiho thought he was using Seojun. And underneath all of it, underneath the shells and the nominees and the falsified invoices and the phantom contracts, a fundamental truth that had been there since the first 34,000 discrepancies she had found by accident on a night when her arm was bleeding and she had 3 hours until deadline. Someone had been stealing. Someone had been building. And she had followed the numbers to the end of them without stopping, not because she was brave, but because she was constitutionally incapable of letting a wrong number stand uncorrected. That had brought her here. To a 31st floor at 4 in the morning, with 5 days to build a case that would have to survive a room full of people, whose interests were aligned against her, against a man who had just discovered that the person he trusted most had been managing him for 3 years, and against a clock that was running in a direction she could not control. She saved the revised diagram. She opened the ledger, kept working, and 5 floors below, in a secured room whose existence appeared on no building directory, Park Jinwoo sat alone with his hands folded on a metal table and looked at the wall and understood with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 3 years building something intricate and patient that the thing he had failed to account for was not Seojun's security operation, not Daiho's ambition, not the transfer window or the monitoring framework or any of the variables he had modeled with such care. He had failed to account for an analyst who ran every available field in a database, because she could not, on a fundamental level, make peace with incomplete data. And somewhere across the city, Yoon Daeho's phone buzzed with a message from a number that should have been active and was not, and he looked at it for a long moment in the dark of his office. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt the floor shift, under something he had been very certain was solid. The 5 days were not 5 days. They were 4 days and 19 hours, because at 11 a.m. on the 4th day, Hyeon walked into the 29th floor apartment where Imani had been working since 5 in the morning, and without softening it, Daiho moved the summit. It's tonight. Imani looked up from the ledger. How much notice? 2 hours. It's already been communicated to all parties. 2 hours. She looked at the screen. The consolidated ledger was 91% complete. She had been building it for 4 days, with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the document she was constructing was not a financial report, it was a weapon. And weapons that were 91% assembled were not weapons, they were liabilities. Where, she said. Hanail Meridian Conference Center, 42nd floor. He used the Alliance Agreement's emergency convening clause requires Seojun to host on 24 hours notice, but Daiho's attorney interpreted that as 2 hours because the clause language is ambiguous. Hyeon paused. He did it on purpose. The ambiguity was always there. He's been saving it. Imani closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 4 days would have been enough. 4 days and 19 hours was not. If the remaining 9% contained what she believed, it contained the final chain of receiving accounts from the transfer, the ones that connected Daiho's network to the port access contracts he intended to absorb. Without those accounts documented, her ledger proved theft and internal conspiracy. With them, it proved the specific mechanism by which Daiho intended to dismantle Hanail Meridian's operational independence and absorb its port infrastructure. The difference between those two documents was the difference between a crime and a coup. She opened her eyes. "Get me Seojun," she said. Seojun arrived in 7 minutes, which meant he had been on the floor, or close to it, which meant he had known about the timeline change before Hyun came to her, which meant he had been calculating the same gap she was calculating and had come to terms with it already. He looked at the screen, at the ledger percentage, at her face. "What do you need?" he said. "The port access contract files. The original alliance agreement drafts, not the executed version, the working drafts with Daiho's annotations, and the complete freight routing records from the 3 port operations contacts Jinwoo identified. I need them in the next 90 minutes. You'll have them in 45. And I need a display set up on the 42nd floor that I control. Not Daiho's tech staff, not shared infrastructure. My machine, my connection, my display. Non-negotiable." Seojun looked at Hyun. Hyun nodded and left. "What's your read on tonight?" Imani said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the same posture he'd had in her office on the 31st floor across 8 months of visits that had started as professional and become something harder to categorize. "He's going to use the summit to make the accusation, before I can make mine. He knows his network has been losing coherence. 2 of his port contacts went dark yesterday. One of Jinwoo's people reached out to him through a back channel before Hyun's team could contain it. He knows Jinwoo is out of play. He doesn't know why yet, but he knows the architecture has changed and he's moving before it changes further." Seojun paused. "He's going to come at you directly, in front of the room. You said that 5 days ago. Now I'm certain of it." He looked at her steadily. "He's going to stand in front of 40 people and tell them that a black financial analyst with no organizational history and no verified loyalty to anyone has been manipulating the internal accounts of Hanul Meridian Group as part of an inappropriate personal relationship with me. He'll frame the ledger as fabricated. He'll frame the shell account evidence as planted. And he'll frame the entire thing as an attempt by an outsider to destabilize a legitimate alliance between 2 established organizations." Imani looked at him. "That's a specific script," she said. "He's had months to write it. And Sharon?" A pause. "She's attending. She won't support him publicly, but she won't oppose him publicly either. She's positioning to survive, whichever way this goes." Imani nodded slowly. She had expected that. Sharon was many things, but stupid was not among them. "Then we need the ledger to be so complete and so documented that there is no version of tonight where the accusation lands," she said. "Not because the room trusts me, because the numbers don't leave them a choice." 9%, he said. 80 minutes, she said back. He stood. "I'll get you the files." He left. Imani turned back to her screen and worked with the specific ferocious focus of someone who had reduced every external variable to a single controllable point and was going to control it until it was finished or she wasn't. The files arrived in 38 minutes, hand-delivered by one of Seojun's people on a secured drive. She plugged it in and started pulling the freight routing records immediately, cross-referencing them against the shell account transfer architecture she had already documented, building the final chain that connected Daiho's financial network to the specific port access contracts he intended to capture through the alliance restructuring. It was there. All of it. The routing regs matched the transfer architecture with the precision of a structure that had been designed to fit together, because Jinwoo had built the financial layer to mirror the operational layer, and Daiho had built the operational layer, believing he was the one who designed it. The ledger hit 100% at 1:14 p.m. Imani sat back. She looked at the document on her screen. 4 months of siphoned funds, 18 months of layered shell construction, 27 accounts across 6 jurisdictions, 43 falsified freight invoices, and the complete chain from Daiho's network through to the port access contracts he had planned to absorb. It was the most complete financial evidence document she had ever built in her professional life. It was also the document that was going to be called a fabrication by a man with 40 years of organizational authority, in a room full of people whose interests were entangled with the answer in approximately 4 hours. She saved it in 4 locations, encrypted the external copy, and sent a version to an attorney whose contact information soon had given her 2 days ago with the instruction that if anything happened to the primary copies, this person would know what to do. She did not ask what anything happening meant. She already knew. At 2 p.m. she changed into the clothes she had brought in her bag 4 days ago when she moved into the 29th floor dark blazer, dark trousers, the specific combination of professional and deliberate that said, "I am not here by accident, and I am not leaving." She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for approximately 5 seconds. Then she picked up her laptop and went upstairs. The 42nd floor was the building's event and conference level, larger than the operational floors. Designed to accommodate the kind of meetings where the numbers of people in the room were themselves a statement. The main conference space had a long central table that seated 30, a surrounding ring of secondary seating observers and staff, display screens on 3 walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that gave Chicago's skyline the particular dramatic weight of a city that had been built by people who understood that size communicated power. Hyun was already there, configuring the display setup Imani had requested. She had placed Imani's station at the south end of the table, not a secondary observer position, but a primary seat, directly opposite from where Daiho would be seated at the north end. Imani looked at the positioning. "That's deliberate," she said. "Yes," Hyun said. "He'll see it as a challenge." "Yes," Hyun said again, with the particular economy of someone who had been doing this work long enough to understand that the staging of a confrontation was as important as the confrontation itself. People began arriving at 3:30. Seojun's captains came first 6 men and 2 women, whose ages ranged from late 30s to late 60s, who had been inside Hanul Meridian's structure long enough to have opinions about everything, and whose presence in the room tonight was less about the summit's official agenda than about what the summit's outcome would mean for their specific positions within the organization. They took their seats with the careful attention of people who were reading the room before committing to any single interpretation of it. Then came Daiho's people, 4 senior members of the Yoon organization, a legal representative, and 2 individuals whose function was not stated and did not need to be. They entered as a group, took positions on the north side of the table, and Imani watched each of them clock her position at the south end, with the specific micro-adjustment of people recalculating a room against expectations. Sherin arrived at 3:47, alone, which was itself information. She took a seat in the observer ring rather than at the primary table, which was more information. She looked at Imani once briefly with an expression that was so controlled it communicated enough, except that she was working very hard to communicate nothing. Daiho came in at 3:53, 7 minutes before the scheduled start, which was early enough to claim the room's energy before Seojun arrived, and late enough to make an entrance. He was 61, broad across the shoulders, in the way that some men carried themselves into age without losing the physical authority of it, with gray at his temples, and the specific quality of ease that came from decades of being the most powerful person in most rooms. He wore a dark suit and no tie, and he moved through the space the way water moved through a defined channel without appearing to exert pressure while exerting considerable pressure. He looked at the table. He looked at Imani. His expression did not change. He looked at her for long enough, and with enough of a specific quality, the assessment of a man who has identified a problem and is calculating its dimensions, that every person who caught it understood something had already shifted between them. He sat at the north end of the table. Seojun arrived at 4 p.m. precisely. He came in without a secondary entourage, just Hyun flanking him at the appropriate distance, and one of his security personnel who took a position near the door. He was wearing a dark jacket, no tie, and had the bearing of a man who had slept 4 hours in the past and had made a specific internal decision about what that meant and what it didn't. He sat at the head of the table, equidistant between north and south. He did not look at Imani. He did not look at Daiho. He looked at the room with the focused, comprehensive attention of someone running a complete inventory before anything began. "We'll start," he said. Daiho did not wait for any procedural opening. "I want the analyst removed from this meeting," he said. The room's temperature changed immediately. Seojun looked at him. "No. Her presence here is irregular. This is an alliance summit between 2 organizational leaderships. She has no standing at this table. She's here at my direction. Her standing is mine to determine. Her access to the Hanul Meridian accounts is what I'm here to discuss," Daiho said. "Having her in the room is a conflict. Her access to those accounts is what I'm here to discuss as well, Seojun said. So her presence is relevant to both agendas. We'll proceed. Pause. Daeho's legal representative made a note. Two of Seojun's captains exchanged a look that was not quite a glance. Daeho settled back in his chair. He had made the opening move. It had not landed. He was recalibrating, and he was doing it fast. And the speed of his recalibration was its own indicator of how many scenarios he had modeled before walking into the room. Then let's discuss it directly, he said. Miss Rowe accessed the senior freight accounts of Hanul Meridian Group over a period of 3 weeks without authorization from the Financial Oversight Committee. During that period, she generated transaction reports that have since been used to make allegations against members of this alliance. He let that settle. I want to understand the authorization chain for her access. And I want to understand the chain of custody for documents she allegedly produced. He did not look at Imani when he said it. He looked at Seojun, which was the correct tactical choice, framing it as a governance question between two organizational principles rather than a direct confrontation with the person he was trying to neutralize. Seojun said her access was authorized under the terms of her engagement contract, which predates any concern about the account she accessed. The documents she produced were delivered to me directly, by her unverified, in the middle of the night, verified by my technical team over the subsequent 5 days. Your technical team, Daeho said, which includes personnel whose integrity is now being questioned as part of the same allegations. A beat of silence. That was the move. Imani saw it in full as Daeho made it the reference to Jinwoo's involvement, framed as contamination of Seojun's verification process, deployed to create the impression that the entire chain of evidence had been handled by people with compromised interests. He didn't name Jinwoo. He didn't have to. The suggestion was enough. Seojun said, the verification was conducted by external forensic accountants. He slid a folder across the table toward Daeho's legal representative. Their report is there. Independent firm. No organizational affiliation. Their findings are consistent with the internal ledger. The legal representative opened the folder, looked at it. Something in his posture shifted minutely in the way that a man's posture shifts when he encounters something he was not told to expect. Daeho's eyes moved to the folder, then to Imani, and for the first time, something moved in his face that was not control, a flicker, brief and quickly suppressed, of a man recalculating against a variable he had not included in his modeling. I'd like to hear from Ms. Rowe directly, he said. The room reacted not visibly, but in the collective shift of attention that constituted a room's reaction when someone says something that changes the structure of what is happening. Seojun looked at Imani. She met his eyes. He gave the smallest nod. She turned to Daeho. What would you like to know? She said. Her voice was even. She had made it, even with the same deliberate control she applied to everything that mattered, because the thing Daeho needed most from her right now was a reaction, and she was not going to give it to him. How long have you been in a personal relationship with Han Seojun? Question landed like a dropped object in a quiet room. Two of Seojun's captains went very still. Sheerin in the observer ring looked at the table. Daeho's people on the north side maintained their collective neutrality with professional discipline. Imani looked at Daeho for 1 full second, just one. I'm his financial analyst, she said. That's the complete description of our relationship. The documents you presented to him were delivered in his private office at 5 in the morning. The documents required immediate delivery. The time was determined by when I completed the analysis. You have after-hours keycard access to the executive floors, granted by the terms of my engagement contract, which predates any account access he's questioning. You were relocated to a company residential facility 4 days ago. The room moved again, this time more perceptibly. The shift of people encountering information they did not have and reassessing its implications in real time. Imani had expected this. She had known Daeho would use it. She had prepared for it the same way she prepared for every variable she could identify by deciding in advance exactly what the truth was and delivering it without modification. I was relocated at the recommendation of the company's security team, she said, following a security incident at my personal residence. The incident is documented. What incident? Unauthorized surveillance. Photographs taken from outside my building. She paused. I can provide those documents as well. if the room would like to review the full chain of events that preceded my relocation. A silence. Daiho had not expected her to offer that. She could see it a single of stillness before he replied, the specific stillness of a man who has pursued a line of questioning and found it returning toward him. That's not necessary, he said. Then perhaps we could move to the financial records, she said, since that's what the room is actually here to assess. Daiho looked at her. It was the longest, flattest look she had received from anyone in her professional life. A sound like green wood splitting, it was the look of a man who had spent 40 years being the most dangerous person in the room and was encountering, for the first time in some considerable while, something that was not afraid of that. Go ahead, he said. She connected her laptop to the display. The first screen showed the consolidated ledger overview, 43 months of account activity, flagged transactions highlighted in a format that any reasonably financially literate person in the room could follow. She had built it that way deliberately. Financial evidence that required expertise to interpret was evidence that could be questioned. Evidence that was self-explanatory was evidence that was simply true. I'll walk through this in 3 sections, she said, and her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and her pulse was not, but her pulse was not visible to the room. The first is the transfer architecture, how the funds moved, and through what entities. The second is the receiving chain, where the funds went and what they were used for. The third is the operational connection, how the financial network connects to specific port access contracts within the alliance agreement. She advanced the display. The initial discrepancy I identified was $34,000, moved from a freight subsidiary to a consulting account on a Sunday evening. That transaction alone was within the range of standard accounting error. What it was not was consistent with any operational activity I could identify in the freight subsidiary's records for that quarter. She advanced again. Following that discrepancy through the account structure revealed a layered network of shell entities operating through Delaware registration with nominee directors. The aggregate transfer amount over 18 months was $1.2 million. She paused. Let the number sit in the room for a moment. I want to be precise about this figure, because precision matters here. $1.2 million is not the total value of the network I'm about to describe. It is the operational budget. The prize is considerably larger. She taught the receiving chain. The room looked at the screen. She walked them through it account by account, transfer by transfer, with the dates and amounts and receiving entities visible and the documentary sourcing visible beside each entry. She did not editorialize. She did not characterize. She stated what the record showed and moved to the next record. Daiho was watching her with an expression that had gone completely still. His legal representative had stopped taking notes. At the fourth screen, the one connecting the shell account transfers to the specific port access contracts targeted within the alliance agreement. One of Seojun's captains, a woman in her 50s named Song, who had been with the organization for 16 years and whom Imani had assessed as one of the most important reads in the room, leaned forward slightly. That was it. That was the moment. A woman who had been present in this organization through things that most people in this city would not survive, leaning forward, because what was on the screen had exceeded the threshold of what could be dismissed. Imani kept going. She did not look at Seojun. She did not look at Sharon. She looked at the screen and at the room and at the numbers, because the numbers were what this was about, and the numbers were what would end it. When she reached the final screen, the complete organizational map of the network, with the account chains, the shell entities, the port operations connections, and the documentary sourcing, all visible simultaneously, she stopped. That's the complete record, she said. The sourcing documentation is available for review. The external verification report is already in front of the room. I can answer questions about any specific transaction or account if there are points the room needs to examine further. A silence that lasted long enough to be substantial. Then Daiho said, "That document was constructed by you, from records you accessed without proper oversight, using a verification process conducted by a firm you were involved in selecting." He had not broken. She had expected that. A man who had built this over 3 years did not break at a presentation, however complete. The selection of the verification firm was made by Seojun's legal team, she said. I had no involvement in that selection. That's documented in the engagement records. Convenient. Accurate, she said, Ms. Rowe. Daeho's voice shifted. Not louder. Lower. The specific register of a man shifting from procedural pressure to something more personal and more direct. Came to Chicago 18 months ago with a consulting placement and no organizational history. You have no standing within either of the structures present in this room. You have a documented personal proximity to the man whose interests are directly served by the allegations you're making. He paused. I'm asking this room to consider what it means that a woman with no verifiable loyalty to anyone has constructed a document that conveniently implicates the leadership of one family's organization while protecting the leadership of the other. Good. She had known he would be good. He had spent 40 years in rooms like this one. But he had made one mistake. He had said no verifiable loyalty to anyone. Seojun said, from the head of the table, I'd like to add something to the record. Daeho looked at him. 3 years ago, Seojun said, Park Jin-woo, my chief of operations, entered into an arrangement with Yoon Daeho to construct a financial network that would be used to facilitate an organizational takeover of Hanuel Meridian following my marriage to Yoon Chae-rin. Jin-woo's role was not as Daeho's subordinate. His role was as the network's architect. Daeho was a component of the structure Jin-woo built, not its designer. The room reacted, this time visibly. Daeho's composure cracked not completely but enough. A single, involuntary shift in the line of his shoulders that betrayed the thing he had not known, that Jin-woo's involvement had been identified and that its full structure was understood. Park Jin-woo is in custody, Seojun said. He has provided a voluntary accounting of the network's construction. That accounting is consistent in every material detail with the ledger Ms. Rowe has just presented. He looked at Daeho steadily. What she found was real. What you built was real. And you used a marriage as the mechanism to deliver a man you thought was your ally into a position where he would have removed you, once his structure was fully operational. The silence now was the specific silence of 40 people absorbing a structural collapse. Daeho looked at Seojun. His expression had the quality of a man who was still doing the math, still looking for the variable that changed the outcome, and finding that the math was closed. He said, This is your word against mine. It is also the ledger, Seojun said. The external verification, Jin-woo's accounting, and the transfer records from 4 nights ago monitored in real time by a team that has submitted its documentation to the legal representatives present in this room. He nodded to Haeon, who distributed a second folder to every person at the primary table. Daeho looked at the folder in front of him. He did not open it. I want to address something directly, Seojun said. His voice changed in the specific way it had changed early, that morning in Imani's apartment when she said, I'm sorry. And he had said for what quieter, more internal, carrying something that was not performative authority, but actual weight. Yoon Daeho has suggested that Imani Rowe's analysis cannot be trusted because she has no verifiable loyalty to anyone in this room. I want to be clear about what that means in practice. He looked at her for the first time during the formal proceedings, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. She found evidence of a serious crime committed against this organization. Could have closed the spreadsheet. She called me at 4 in the morning because she could not allow a false number to stand uncorrected. She has spent the last 2 weeks working inside a building where 12 people were operationally aligned against the outcome she was working toward. She has been surveilled, pressured, and threatened. He returned his gaze to the room. Her loyalty is to the accuracy of the record. In my professional experience, that is the rarest and most reliable form of integrity present in this room tonight. One of Daeho's people at the north end of the table pushed back from their chair and stood. Then a second. Not in aggression, in the specific, deliberate way of people removing themselves from an organizational position before the position became indefensible. Daeho saw it. Something in his face completed its collapse then, not dramatically, not with any visible anguish, but with the quiet, interior quality of a man who has looked at a room and understood that the calculation has resolved, and the resolution is not in his favor. He said, and his voice was steady. She would give him that, even now Chae-rin. From the observer ring, Sharon looked at him. Tell them, he said. Tell them what this actually is. Sharon looked at her uncle for a long moment. Then she looked at Seojun. Then she looked at her hands. I can't, she said quietly, because It's what they said it is. The room went absolutely still. Daeho looked at his niece for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the folder he had not opened. Then he looked at the window, at Chicago 442 floors, at the freight corridors and the port access and the infrastructure he had spent 3 years building a mechanism to absorb. He did not reach for the folder. "My attorney will be in contact," he said. He stood. His people stood with him, those who remained. Sound toward door with the same controlled ease with which he had entered, because he was a man who understood that the way you left a room was the last thing people remembered about you. And he was not going to give this room the satisfaction of watching him break. At the door he stopped. He looked back, not at Seojun, not at the room, at Imani. "You're very good," he said. She held his gaze. "The numbers were always there," she said. "I just didn't look away." He left. The door closed. The room held its collective breath for one long moment, and then Song, the captain who had leaned forward at the fourth screen, exhaled and said something in Korean that Imani didn't follow, but which generated a specific, exhausted quality of response. From the others around the table, not laughter, not relief, but the sound of people releasing pressure that had been building for a very long time. Seon did not look at the room. He was looking at Imani Timber. From the head of the table, with an expression she had not seen on his face, before, not the professional assessment she had become familiar with, not the careful neutrality he maintained in operational spaces, but something underneath both of those, something he was not, at this specific moment, making any effort to conceal. She held it for a moment. Then she looked back at her screen and began the process of securing the ledger copies and closing the display connection, because the meeting had ended, but the work had not, and she was not the kind of person who stopped working simply because the most important moment had passed. But her hands, moving across the keyboard with their practiced precision, were shaking slightly at the knuckles, not from fear, from the specific, overwhelming exhaustion of a person who has been holding something enormous in place for a very long time and has just, in this moment, been permitted to set it down. She kept working. Around her, the room began its gradual reorganization conversations, starting, documentation being exchanged. A sound like the legal representatives moving toward each other with the specific purpose of people who understood that what had just happened in this room would require considerable professional attention in the coming weeks. Hayan appeared at Imani's shoulder. "We need to secure the primary ledger copies and process the transfer documentation through the legal team tonight. It's going to be a long evening." "I know," Imani said. "Are you all right?" Imani looked up from her screen. She considered the question with the same honesty she applied to everything. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again in about 6 hours." Halmost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile Imani had seen on Hyun's face in 2 weeks, and it lasted approximately 1 second before Hyun returned to her professional register and moved away to manage the documentation chain. Imani turned back to her screen. At the head of the table, Seojun was speaking quietly with Song and 2 other captains, handling the immediate organizational questions with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the after a confrontation was as operationally critical as the confrontation itself. She watched him in her peripheral vision, the way he listened before speaking, the way he gave weight to what was said to him, the way he managed a room full of people who had just had their understanding of the last 3 years restructured without making any of them feel diminished by the reorganization. He was not a simple man. She had known that from the beginning. She had known it in the way you know the structural load of something before you test it, theoretically, from the evidence available, with the awareness that theory and reality were related but not identical. She understood it differently now. She turned back to her work. 40 minutes later, the room had thinned to Seojun's core people and the legal team, working through the documentation with the methodical patience of a process that would not be hurried regardless of what had already happened. Imani was finishing the final ledger archiving when she felt Seojun stop behind her chair. She did not turn around. "The attorney has everything," he said. 2 copies. Encrypted external independent server. The transfer documentation is indexed separately. She saved the final archive. "It's done." A pause. "Come upstairs," he said. "When you're ready." She finished the archiving. She closed her laptop. She stood and her legs were steadier than she expected them to be, given that she had been sitting for 4 hours on adrenaline and 4 hours of sleep, and the particular physical cost of sustained, controlled tension. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the elevator. Behind her, Chicago sat 42 floors below the freight corridors and the port access and the river moving through the city the way it always moved, without caring about any of the things that happened in the buildings above it. And in a quiet room in a building whose address appeared nowhere public, a man named Yoon Dae-ho sat across from his attorney and understood with the specific, comprehensive clarity of someone who had just watched a structure they spent 3 years building resolve against them, that the analyst he had dismissed as a tool had been the one thing in the entire operation he had failed to correctly model, not because she was exceptional in the ways that power typically recognized, but because she was incapable of letting a false number stand. And the ledger, once opened, had only ever been going to close one way. The elevator arrived. Imani stepped in. The doors closed on the 42nd floor, on the room where everything had just changed, on the city that didn't know and wouldn't know, on the particular weight of a night that was not quite finished and would not be finished until the last documents were signed and the last accounts were sealed and the last version of the thing that had been built in the dark was fully dismantled in the light. She rode up. She was not done, but she was, for the first time in 2 weeks, on the right side of it. The elevator opened on the 31st floor, and Imani walked out into a space that felt different than it had 2 weeks ago. Not physically. The floor was the same floor. The windows were the same windows. Chicago was doing the same thing. Chicago always did moving, indifferent, lit up against a sky that had gone completely dark somewhere during the 4 hours they had spent on the 42nd floor dismantling something that had taken 3 years to build. But the quality of the air was different. The weight of it. The way the space held itself around the people still working inside it. And she stood in the corridor for a moment before going in. She was tired in a way that went past the physical past the 4 hours of sleep and the 2 weeks of sustained operational tension and the specific exhaustion of sitting in a room for 4 hours and holding yourself absolutely still while someone tried to take you apart in front of 40 people. It was the tiredness of someone who had been carrying a very specific kind of alertness for so long that setting it down felt structurally disorienting, like a load-bearing wall that had been removed, and now the building had to figure out what was holding it up. Instead, she breathed. Then she went in. Seojun was at the conference table with Hyun and 2 members of the legal team, working through the documentation chain with the same focused efficiency he had brought to every operational detail of the past 2 weeks. He looked up when she came in. He did not stop what he was doing, but his attention shifted in the specific way that certain people's attention shifted completely without announcement, so that even while he was continuing to speak to the legal team, his focus had reorganized itself around her presence in the room. She sat at the far end of the table and opened her laptop. "The Jinwoo accounting," she said to Hyun. "Has it been formally cross-referenced against the ledger?" "We finished that at 6, Hyun said. "Consistent across all 43 transactions. His dates match yours. His account identifications match yours. The only discrepancy is in the original construction timeline. He says 28 months. Your records suggest 30. We're treating that as memory imprecision rather than contradiction." 28 or 30, the structure is the same, Imani said. "Yes." And Daeho's attorney made contact at 5:40. "They're requesting a formal meeting tomorrow morning with both legal teams present." Hyun paused. "They are not in a position to contest the financial evidence. The request is about terms." Imani looked at Seojun across the length of the table. He looked back and said nothing, which was the specific nothing. That meant this is already being handled, and I'll tell you the details when the room is smaller. She nodded and returned to her screen. They worked for another 2 hours. The legal team finished their documentation chain at 9:15 and left with instructions to have the formal evidentiary package ready by 8 a.m. Hyun processed the final transfer records and sent them to the external attorney with a confirmation message that Imani drafted and Seojun signed. The 2 remaining security personnel on the floor were reassigned to standard building protocol, which was the first time in 2 weeks that the 31st floor had operated on standard protocol. At 9:47, the floor was empty except for Seojun and Imani. He was standing at the window. She was still at the table, finishing the last index of the ledger archive, a task that could have waited until morning, and that she was completing now because she did not yet know how to be in this room without work between them. She finished the index. She closed the laptop. The room was quiet except for Chicago's ambient sound through the glass traffic, wind off the lake, the low mechanical presence of a city that didn't stop. She said, without looking up, "What are the terms going to be?" Seojun turned from the window. Daeho surrenders his organization's claim to the port access contracts. All alliance agreement provisions that would have enabled procedural restructuring are void. The financial restitution comes from the Yoon organization's operational accounts. And Daeho personally? His attorney is going to argue for a managed exit. No criminal referral in exchange for full cooperation and asset disclosure. A pause. "I haven't decided yet. What are you inclined toward?" He looked at her. "Honestly, yes. I don't know," he said. It came out flat and real, without the practiced quality of a man managing a room's perception of his certainty. 20 years ago, the answer would have been automatic. There would have been no attorney, no terms, no managed exit. He looked back at the window. "I'm not that version of this organization anymore. Or I'm trying not to be." Imani was quiet for a moment. "The cooperation and asset disclosure," she said. "If it's complete, if it gives you everything you don't already have on the network, that's operationally more valuable than the alternative. I know. And a criminal referral creates exposure. Investigations pull threads. I know that too. So the managed exit is probably the right call." "Probably," he said. "But it costs something." He looked at her again. And this time there was something in it that was not operational, a specific, unguarded quality that she had seen in him, only in certain moments, the moments when the distance he maintained between what he was and how he presented it had gotten thin enough to see through. "Yes," he said. "It costs something." She held that for a moment. "The 4 people on Jinwoo's side of the network," she said, "the ones Haeon pulled in the first 48 hours. What happens to them? 2 have already entered into cooperation agreements. The other 2 are being managed." He paused. "Nobody is going to disappear, if that's what you're asking." It was what she was asking. She was glad he understood that, without her having to be more specific. "And Jinwoo?" she said. The silence that followed was longer than the others. "Jinwoo is a separate question," Seojun said finally. She waited. "He built something against me," Seojun said. "He built it carefully and patiently over 3 years while sitting at my table and eating at my table and making decisions with me that I believed were being made in good faith. He was my chief of operations. He had access to everything." A pause. "And he used Daeho as a mechanism the way you'd use." He stopped. Started again. "The part that is hard to locate is not the betrayal. I've dealt with betrayal before. The part that is hard to locate is that I trusted him more than I've trusted most people in my life. And he knew that. And he built the network anyway." Imani looked at him steadily. "He told you his reason," she said. "Yes." "Do you believe it?" A long pause. "I believe it was his reason. I don't believe it was a sufficient one." "No," she said. "It wasn't." Seojun exhaled a short, controlled breath that was the closest thing she had seen from him to an unmanaged physical response in 2 weeks. "He'll be referred," he said. "Not managed. Referred." Another pause. "Some things don't have a managed exit." Imani nodded. They were quiet for a moment. The room held the specific quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and had arrived on the other side of it and were in the process of determining what existed in this new space. Imani said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "The board position. Director of Financial Integrity. You had Bora send me the preliminary terms 3 days ago." "Yes." "You sent them in the middle of the summit preparation, when we had about 40 hours until Daeho moved up the timeline." "Yes," he said again. "Why then?" He turned fully from the window and looked at her across the table. "Because if the summit went wrong, and the ledger didn't hold, and the room didn't move, I wanted you to have a documented offer on record from this organization. Something that established your role and your authority in terms that existed independent of the outcome." He paused. "I didn't want the offer to look like a reward for a successful result. I wanted it to be on record before the result." Imani looked at him for a moment. "That's a very careful distinction," she said. "You're a very careful person," he said. "I thought you'd noticed the difference." She had noticed. She had noticed it at 2 days ago, at 3 in the morning when she read the preliminary terms for the first time, and she had filed it in the internal drawer she kept for things that required processing time she didn't currently have, and she had closed the drawer and gone back to the ledger. The terms need to be rewritten, she said. He waited. The reporting structure goes to the board, not to you. I won't report to you. If I'm director of financial integrity, my independence has to be structural, not dependent on your willingness to respect it. I agree, he said. I had Bora include that language in the preliminary draft. The salary needs adjustment. The number in the draft is generous. It's also slightly above the industry benchmark for this role, which means it can be characterized as personal compensation rather than professional rate. She paused. I want the industry benchmark, not above. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between exasperation and something that was not exasperation at all. You want to be paid less than I offered you. I want to be paid correctly. There's a difference. Most people don't argue down their own salary. Most people haven't spent 2 weeks building a ledger that proves why financial accuracy matters, she said. I'm not going to undermine my own argument on the first day. He was quiet for a moment. Then all right, and I need 30 days before I start. I need to properly close out my consulting engagement, and I need to find an apartment. Something shifted in his expression. You're leaving the 29th floor, he said. I was never moving into the 29th floor. I was staying there temporarily during an operational situation that has now resolved. She looked at him evenly. I'm going to find an apartment with windows that face something I want to look at. I'm going to sign a lease in my own name and pay rent with my own money and live there as someone who chose it rather than someone who needed to be somewhere safe. Seojun looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. You're not going to argue. No. She paused. Why not? Because you just described the thing you need most after everything that's happened, he said. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong about what you need. Imani looked at him. Something in her chest did the specific thing it had been doing in his proximity for several weeks now, a kind of pressure that was not uncomfortable, but that she did not entirely know what to do with, that she had been filing in the same drawer as everything else that required processing time she didn't have. She was running out of things that could be filed. First aid kit, she said. He looked mildly confused. The night I called you at 4 in the morning, you treated my arm with a kit from your cabinet. Professional-grade kit. She paused. You've done that before. For someone. More than once. A long silence. My brother, he said. There were times when getting to a hospital wasn't possible. I learned what I needed to learn. She had not asked about his brother before. She had known from the fragments Seojun had let fall over 8 months a reference here, a particular expression. When certain subjects came near, that the brother's death was the event that had reorganized everything. The way certain losses reorganized everything so thoroughly that the life before them became almost theoretical. What was his name, she said. Seojun was quiet for a moment. Juno, he said. How long ago? 11 years. He looked at the window. He was 34. He was better at this than I am. At managing people. Getting them to trust him without fear. A pause. I've spent 11 years trying to build something that doesn't require what it required before him. Something that runs on different terms. He paused again. Jinwoo thought that was weakness. That's what he meant about direction. He thought I was softening the organization into something vulnerable. He was wrong, Imani said. I know. The organization survived this because it had financial infrastructure strong enough to be audited. Because you hired an outside analyst with actual independence. Because when I brought you evidence that implicated someone close to you, you chose accuracy over loyalty. She looked at him steadily. That's not weakness. That's what Junho was probably trying to build toward too. Seojun looked at her. Nobody had said that to him before. She could tell by the way it landed, not dramatically, not with any visible disruption, but with the specific quality of something that reaches a place that has been waiting for a long time to be reached and does not know immediately what to do with the contact. He said nothing. She said nothing either. They stayed in the quiet for a moment, and it was not uncomfortable. Then she stood and picked up her laptop bag and said, I'm going to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Yes, he said. The terms meeting with Daiho's attorney. I want to be present. I'll have Bora put you on the calendar. Thank you. She moved toward the elevator. the elevator bank, she stopped. Not because she had calculated it, just because stopping felt right. Seojun, she said. He was still standing at the window. He looked at her. What you said in the room tonight, about my loyalty being to the accuracy of the record. She paused. You didn't have to say that in front of them. He looked at her steadily. I know, you said it anyway. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you. She got in the elevator. Sup scene. She rode down to the 29th floor, changed out of the blazer and trousers she had worn through the longest day of the past 2 weeks, and lay down on the bed in the spare apartment with the river visible through a gap in the curtains. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She did not dream. The next 3 months were not easy. She had not expected them to be. Daeho's attorney arrived the following morning with the specific, measured bearing of someone who understood the strength of their client's position precisely and had calibrated their posture accordingly, which is to say, carefully and without arrogance. Terms meeting lasted 4 hours. The cooperation agreement that emerged from it was comprehensive and, in Imani's professional assessment, as complete as a document of its kind was ever going to be. Daeho surrendered the port access claims. The alliance agreement's restructuring provisions were voided in their entirety. The asset disclosure covered 6 jurisdictions and 14 entities. The financial restitution was structured over 18 months, with Haniel Meridian's legal team holding enforcement mechanisms that made default materially impossible. There was no criminal referral for Daeho. There was one for Jinwoo. It was filed quietly, through channels that did not generate public attention, by an attorney whose professional relationship with the matter would have been difficult to explain to anyone not already familiar with how certain things were handled in Chicago's financial and legal infrastructure. The charges were specific and documented, and, in the attorney's professional opinion, uncontestable given the evidence. Imani reviewed the filing before it went out. Seojun had asked her to. She made 2 corrections to the financial characterization in the evidentiary summary minor, technical, kind of thing that mattered only if the defense ever pushed to examine the document's precision, and returned it with a note that said it was ready. She did not feel satisfied when the filing went out. She had expected to feel something definitive resolution, or relief, or the specific closure that was supposed to come when things were finished. What she felt instead was a quieter thing, the acknowledgement that this was the correct outcome, arrived at through the correct process, and that correct did not mean painless. Jinwoo had known her for 2 weeks. He had used her the way he had used everything as a mechanism in a structure he was building toward a specific end. The fact that his plan had resolved against him through the one variable he had failed to model did not make him less intelligent or less dangerous. It made him someone who had built a very precise machine and had not accounted for the one component that operated outside his parameters. She thought about that, sometimes, in the weeks that followed, about what it meant to be the variable that didn't fit the model, about whether that was something to be proud of or simply something to be. She decided it was simply something to be. She found the apartment in the 3rd week of November. It was on the 14th floor of a building in Lincoln Park, not large, with windows on the east and south sides that gave her a full view of the lake and, on clear days, a slant of light in the late afternoon that came through the southern windows and crossed the floor of the main room in a way that she found unexpectedly beautiful. The building was well maintained. The landlord responded to her emails within 24 hours. The lease was standard, and she read every line of it before signing. She moved in on a Saturday. She owned, less than most people her age, a habit of not accumulating things that she might need to leave behind, and the apartment was sparsely furnished for the first 2 weeks, which did not bother her. She bought a good bed and a good desk and a chair she could sit in for hours, without her back protesting, and she considered those the essentials and everything else negotiable. She started as Director of Financial Integrity at Haniel Meridian on the 1st of December. The first thing she did was restructure the internal audit protocols to create a mandatory separation between a pre-operational account management and oversight review, a structural change that would have caught Daeho's network in its first quarter of operation had it existed 18 months ago. The second thing she did was hire 2 additional analysts, both sourced through external channels with no organizational history in Haniel Meridian, Both compensated at rates that made lateral movement into private finance more attractive than compromise. Seojun signed off on both changes without modification. She had half expected him to push back on the staffing costs. He did not. He read the proposal, asked 2 clarifying questions about the reporting structure, and approved it the same day. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. Working in the same building as Seojun was different than working for him had been. The distinction was structural, and also, she reported, to the board, not to him, which meant their professional interactions were lateral rather than hierarchical. A sound like green wood splitting, which meant every conversation between them was occurring between 2 people who were choosing to have it, rather than one person performing a function for another. She had not fully considered what that would feel like. He continued his habit of appearing in her office several times a week, sometimes with a specific question, sometimes to stand at the window and drink coffee while the city moved below. She still had a second cup ready when she heard his footsteps in the corridor, and she had stopped pretending this was not deliberate. In December, he told her, he had retained an independent advisory firm to assess which components of Hanul Meridian's operational structure could be separated from the criminal infrastructure he had inherited and converted to fully legitimate business. The assessment was expected to take 6 months. The process of actual separation, based on preliminary estimates, would take several years. She said, "That's a long timeline." He said, "Yes. You're committed to it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him. Junho would have done this faster. He almost smiled. The same small, incomplete expression she had seen in her office 2 months ago, the one that had probably never made it all the way to his face in front of anyone else. "Probably," he said. "You're more careful than he was. He'd argue that too." "I believe you," she said. In January, Sharon called. Imani did not know she had her number until the call came, a blocked number, unrecognized, that she almost didn't answer, and then answered on the last ring because not answering felt like a decision she might regret. Ms. Rowe. Sharon's voice had the same composed quality it always had, but something in its register was different, lighter in some indefinable way, like a room in which something heavy had been removed. "Ms. Yoon," Imani said. A brief pause. "I wanted to tell you that I'm leaving Chicago." "Where are you going?" "Seoul, initially. After that, I haven't decided." Another pause. "I wanted you to know that I was not involved in Daeho's network. Beyond knowing it existed." "I know," Imani said. "The ledger showed your accounts clean." "I know you know. I wanted to say it directly anyway." A pause. "You're the only person involved in all of this who deserved to hear it directly." Imani was quiet for a moment. "What about Seojun?" she said. "He knows," Sharon said. "We've spoken about everything." A pause that had a particular texture to it. "He's not who I thought he was when I agreed to the arrangement. He's more." She stopped. "Then, I think you already know that." Imani did not answer. "I hope the new role is what you need," Sharon said. "I mean that honestly." "I believe you," Imani said. Call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at the lake through her south window. The light on the water was the specific flat gray of Chicago. In January, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything and made everything look exactly as it was. She thought about Sharin moving through Seoul in the new year, constructing whatever came next from whatever was left. She thought about Park Jinwoo in a process that was going to take as long as it took and was not going to resolve cleanly regardless of outcome. She thought about Yoon Daeho in a quieter version of his life, stripped of the architecture he had spent years building, managing whatever reduced form of operation remained to him. She thought about her mother, working double shifts through February every year, managing impossible things with a straight back. She thought about what it meant to be 32 years old and sitting in an apartment you chose, at a desk you bought, with a view of a lake you wanted to look at. She decided it meant something she did not have precise language for yet. She returned to work. The evening that changed the particular shape of things between her and Seojun arrived in February, on a night when the lake was doing the violent thing it did. In February, whined off the water hard enough to rattle windows. Temperature in the single digits. Chicago wearing its worst weather with the specific lack of apology of a city that had long since stopped explaining itself. She had worked late not because of crisis, which was new, but because she was absorbed in the structural analysis of a subsidiary separation that had turned out to be more interesting than expected. She was still at her desk at 8 p.m. when she heard his footsteps in the corridor, which was later than he usually came, and then the knock on her open door. She looked up. He was in his coat, which meant he had been somewhere outside the building and had come here instead of going directly home, and he was carrying a paper bag that he set on the edge of her desk without explanation. "You didn't eat," he said. She looked at the bag. She had not eaten since noon. She had been aware of this in the same distant, deferable way. She had always been aware of things her body needed as a variable she would address when there was room in the schedule. "How do you know that?" she said. "Because I walked past your office at noon, and you were at your desk, and there was no food, and I walked past at 4, and there was still no food, and it's now 8 o'clock. You walked past my office at 4? I had a meeting on this floor." She looked at him. "You don't have any meetings on this floor on Thursdays." He did not answer which was the answer. She opened the bag. It was from a Korean restaurant near the building, not a place she had been to, but one she had noticed, because it was small, and the menu in the window was handwritten, and handwritten menus in small restaurants were the reliable indicator of food that was actually cooked by someone who cared. She ate. He sat in the chair across her desk and drank from a coffee cup he had brought himself, and looked at the lake through her windows with the specific quality of someone who had not come here for any operational reason and was not going to pretend otherwise. When she finished eating, she folded the bag and said, "Thank you." He looked at her. "This is not a debt," she said. "I'm not keeping a ledger on this."
"Say, sir."
Something in his face shifted the same interior movement she had seen on the 31st floor when she had told him to be careful, when concern had reached him from a direction he was not accustomed to receiving it from. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you explicitly, because I want to be clear about the terms." "Imani," she stopped. "I know," he said again, quieter. She looked at him across the desk, at the man who had treated her wound in silence, and posted a car outside her building without saying so, and sent a job offer in the middle of a crisis to establish it on record before the outcome. Who had said her loyalty was to the accuracy of the record in front of 40 people, not because it helped his position, but because it was true and she had earned the truth being said. Who had spent 11 years trying to build something that ran on different terms. She said, "I've spent my whole life treating every received thing as a debt, every favor as an obligation, every kindness as the beginning of a balance sheet." "I know," he said. "It's a hard habit." "Yes, I'm working on it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know that too." She looked back at him. At the lake beyond her window, at the room she had chosen and the desk she had bought, and the view she had specifically wanted, all the specific choices of a person learning, slowly and with difficulty, that independence did not require the elimination of warmth. She reached across the desk, not dramatically, not with the practiced quality of a gesture that had been rehearsed or considered. Just across the desk, her hand finding his on the surface between them, her fingers closing around the scarred knuckles. She had noticed, the first night, she sat in his office, and had looked at, in the peripheral way she looked at all things she was not ready to look at directly. He turned his hand over. He held hers. They sat like that for a moment, with Chicago doing its February thing outside the windows, and the lake being violent and indifferent in the dark, and the 31st floor somewhere above them, where everything had begun, and the 29th floor somewhere above that, where she had slept in a spare room and worked until 2 in the morning and learned what it meant to be inside. A situation she could not manage alone. She did not calculate the cost. She had spent 32 years calculating costs of need, of trust, of letting someone close enough to matter. The math had always been the same, and the answer had always been the same, and the answer had kept her safe and solitary, and had been, she understood now, the longest-running false number in her professional life. She had found it. She was not going to let it stand. Seojun said after a while, "The lake is rough tonight." "Yes," she said. "You like watching it." "I like that it doesn't care," she said. "It just does what it does. The weather, the city, everything happening in the buildings, it just moves." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that about the Han River, that it moved through everything Seoul was doing and didn't take sides." She looked at him. He had never mentioned his mother before. She filed it, the way she filed everything carefully, with full attention, without reaching for more than was offered. "He was right," Imani said. She usually was. A pause. She died the same year as Junho, 6 months after. I think she decided the world without him. It was a different world, and she wasn't interested in navigating it. He said it plainly, without self-pity. He said the true things about loss, after enough time had passed, that the truth was simply the truth. I've thought about that a lot. About choosing to stay in a world that's changed into something harder than what you expected. And she said, and I think the choice is made differently, depending on what you have to stay for. He looked at her. I have more to stay for than I did 11 years ago. She looked back at him. She understood that she was part of that more. Not the whole of it. She would not have wanted to be the whole of it. Would not have trusted a man whose reason for staying in the world was concentrated in a single person, because that was a kind of need that consumed the thing it needed. But part of it, a meaningful part, arrived at, honestly, through 2 weeks of crisis and 8 months of careful attention and one decision at 4 a.m. on a kitchen floor in a broken apartment that had set everything else in motion. I have more to stay for too, she said. She meant the apartment, the desk, the view, the work. She meant the structural changes she was making to an organization that was trying, slowly and with difficulty, to become something different than what it had been built to be. She meant the specific version of herself she was constructing in this new phase, less defended, not undefended, more open, not unguarded, capable still, of managing alone, but no longer required to prove it by refusing everything else. She meant the man across the desk with his scarred hands and his careful decisions and his 11 years of trying to build something that ran on different terms. She meant all of it. Outside, the lake moved. It didn't take sides. It just moved through everything the city was and ET'd, through the lights and the freight corridors and the buildings with their complicated interiors, through the grief and the construction and the long, slow work of becoming something other than what you were forced to begin as, through all of it. And on a 14th floor in Lincoln Park, in an apartment with lake-facing windows that caught the afternoon light in a specific way that Imani had decided was worth staying for, 2 people sat across a desk from each other in the February dark and held on. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in the way that stories sometimes suggested, clean and resolved and without remainder, but honestly, with full knowledge of who they each were and what they each carried and what it had taken to arrive here. The ledger was balanced, not because everything had been repaid, but because some things, finally, had been allowed to exist outside the ledger entirely. And that, for the first time in 32 years, was enough.